Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Centre for Contemporary Photography, to CCP. I do feel on an angle, so I'm going to stand here as I'm not showing any slides. Hello, thank you for coming out on a cold evening to sit in a very cold place, but it is warm with ideas and opportunity to engage, so thank you for being here. My name is Naomi Cass and I'm the Director of CCP. I work here. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri as the first owners of this country and who are still the custodians of the cultural heritage of this land, and we acknowledge their continuing contribution to this marvellous part of the world. Welcome to the first of two evenings entitled Memory, Sound, Sight and Object through Theory, Practice and Emotions. This is a collaboration between CCP and the ARC Centre of Excellence for the History of Emotions. And this is the second year that we've been working together. We are most grateful to the Centre, particularly for the pleasure of working with Penelope Lee, with great encouragement from Professor Stephanie Trigg. The context in which we will be hearing this evening from Stephanie Trigg, Albertine Hamilton and Daniel Little is this exhibition entitled For Future Reference and curated by Pippa Milne, who's one of our CCP curators. This is a beautiful meditation on memory and presents the work of Sophie Carl, Rodney Glick and David Solomon, Siri Hayes, Nova Call, who would normally be screened here, Julian Audrey Smith and Justine Varga. And this represents an opportunity to bring scholars into the gallery context to speak about their research. Now, while we won't be speaking about the works, I don't think the speakers will be addressing any of the works individually, it does give us a context. And in the next session, we will actually be hearing from Nova Paul, who's a New Zealand filmmaker, and whose work, if you were visiting the exhibition, you would be able to see in this part of the gallery. So Nova will be speaking in our next session. So at every opportunity, CCP likes to make a mix between the kind of research that's undertaken by academics and the kind of research that's undertaken by artists when making work. As Pippa Milne says in her catalogue essay, photography, because of its capacity to represent reality, has often been seen as a core aid in the dredging of our memories, fleshing out narratives, allaying doubts and confirming of rumours. Of course, it also has the capacity to fabricate, misguide and subvert memory. Artists who have filtered memory through photography in this exhibition, some have drawn upon photographic ideas, some have found connections between photography and personal mythologies, some have addressed collective history, imagined futures, nostalgia, and coerced assumptions. This pillar is really in the wrong I have a need to step over here now. That's an unusual arrangement for the chairs. It is important to reiterate here that while photography feels reliable, I'm sure you all know, in fact, it is not an innocent tool. So each of these artists comes to us from a different history and a different background, and their work could all be discussed in very ways. And that's what a curated or thematic exhibition is. It's this marvellous, rigorous exercise of bringing work together that you may have seen before. That work was shown before, that's been shown before, that's been shown before. But the curator brings a theme and different works together so you see things through a new prism. And this is in fact what we're doing this evening, because we are also bringing together academics and people who are speaking from different points of view. We could exhibit all of these works in another context and we find another whole range of meanings. And of course that would be the case for our speakers as well. So in this session we'll hear from each speaker, and then I think we'll confine ourselves to one or two questions and then move to the next speaker, because the topics are quite different. And then at the end we can reconfigure and have a more broader discussion. So Professor Stephanie Trigg, the title of her talk this evening is The Bluestone Project, Memories, Blogging, Images and History. Stephanie is Professor of English Literature at the University of Melbourne, where she teaches medieval English literature. She is also the leader of the Melbourne node of the ARC Centre for Excellence for the History of the Emotions. She's published many works on medieval literature, especially the long reception history of Geoffrey Chaucer, and on medieval ritual practice. Her work at the centre is focused on three topics: the expression of emotion on the human face in literary texts, as well as the history of emotional responses to fire, and a cultural, affective history of bluestone in Victoria and particularly Melbourne. Tonight, Stephanie will describe her blog, My Year with Bluestone, and the way its impressions and iPhone pictures of bluestone sites around Melbourne and Victoria, how she's going to pull these together into a publication. In a sense, I think she's addressing how space and stone can be imbued with memory. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Naomi. Thank you. This is an early stage in the project, as most research papers are, and so it's always lovely to have it fed back to me. That sounds a good description of what I'm doing. Thank you. As I say, I'm going to be writing a book about this project, and this is a kind of like, I've been keeping this blog just for the course of this year, most of this year. So our Centre for the History of Emotions mostly works on the period 1100 to 1800 around Europe. Most of our researchers are from history, literature, art history, music and performance. But some of our research takes place in a research program called Shaping the Modern. And in that part of our work, we often extend into 19th, 20th, 21st century history, particularly in an Australian context, with a special focus on heritage culture, I guess. So this project is about memory, but it's really also very much about affect and place. And it works very much around the environment. So all the photographs I've taken here are all taken by me on my horrible iPhone, with the exception of a few that I've signalled. So the History of Emotions project, in the case of the Bluestone Project, works through objects, through material culture and the environment. So I don't know if you know, this is a wonderful, down by the Merry Creek, down in Collingwood, there's a bluestone labyrinth made from cobs that was made about 15 years ago. You can go and walk the labyrinth as a meditative place. So this, and also the Merry Creek is lined by bluestone, so it's a wonderful remaking of a very, very ancient meditative form made by kind of a modern revival of place. On the top right is the talisman for this project, a piece of bluestone that I picked up from by the Merry Creek, where I live, and it reminds me that bluestone varies tremendously in its form, depending on the rate at which it cools. So I have a lot to learn about geological history, but it's one of the things I've learned so far. So this piece here cooled very, very quickly, so that the little bubbles of the volcanic basalt are still formed there. So that sits on my desk at home. And then bottom right, familiar Pentridge Prison, a really familiar, iconic site of this bluestone Victorian heritage culture, which I think is really distinctive to Melbourne and Victoria. Sydney is a sandstone city, Melbourne is a bluestone city, and it's really that identity of Melbourne that I really want to bring out in in this project. So that's one of the things that I'm doing. So that's the overarching way of thinking about the history of emotions through this particular form. Normally I work with literary texts, so this is a real departure from me. The second thing, I want to kind of write a long cultural or affective history of basalt or bluestone in Victoria and Melbourne. So on this map on the left of Victoria, that pink area is the area of the basalt plain. It's the third largest basalt volcanic plain in the world. And so you might have been to the Tower Hill volcano outside Warrnambool, Mount Eccles north of the state. These are the volcanoes that produce these basalt flows. And it's very interesting, it's a very local kind of project for people who live north of the river, because that basalt flow kind of stops around where the Merry meets the Yarra at Dights Falls. So on our side of Dights Falls, it's bluestone. On the other side, it's a completely different formation. Absolutely. So it becomes a very, very local project for me. And then on the top right here, this is a kind of like a famous bluestone wall that's still in place along by the Merry Creek. And then the National Gallery, again, another iconic building that is made of that very slow-cooled, very smooth bluestone. The third dimension is really about heritage culture and the history of feeling. So the simple question I'm asking is, how do people think, but mostly how do people feel about this bluestone and what it tells us and them about our city? So this is just a photograph that was in The Age in March this year. You might remember that St James Catholic Church in Brighton was burnt. This is a photograph appeared in The Age. I think it was taken by a neighbour who went to see the church burning. It's an astonishing photograph to see where stained glass windows were now lit up by fire inside. And I just put this comment down from Rachel Griffiths, because mostly when you think about these iconic buildings being destroyed, you think, oh, heritage being destroyed, that's tragic. But because it was the site of corrupt Catholic priesthood practices, Rachel Griffiths' family had been affected by those practices. She said she was elated, and that parts of her community were elated by the burning down of that church. So I found this very, very confronting, this really set of mixed emotions. You have the heritage culture that might make you sad about the burning of the church. Griffiths was absolutely elated, so because it had a whole other set of associations. So those are the kind of complexities that I'm thinking about here. And I'm doing it by blogging about it, partly because you can't write too many things at once, but blogging is a really fantastic way of keeping a chart of a daily progress and research. So I've kept this blog since 2006, and sometimes a bit more actively than others, and sometimes for a long time it was an illness blog, but now it's a bluestone blog. If you go and look at it now, you'll see that it's actually a little bit in advance because it's been a very busy couple of months, but giving this talk has actually reignited my enthusiasm for this project. So what I have tried to do, I didn't always do, I did try and blog Monday to Friday about my experience of bluestone. I would gather bluestone stories. Once you start looking at something like that, it's amazing how often bluestone appears before you. So it just puts another whole filter over the world. So it's great to have a chance to talk like this to a group like you about this project. So send me bluestone pictures, bluestone stories. I mean, I've been amazed that people have come up with the way that they feel about bluestone or its kind of associations. So blogging is a terrific way to work. It's helped me build this research project incrementally. I found that writing is very easy when it's provisional, because a blog is characterised by informal kind of language. So sometimes when you start a big academic project, you think, oh, I've got to do the big theoretical first chapter. But with a blog, you don't have to worry about that. You just write, because I've got to write every day. So it's been very liberating as a writing practice. I've also got instant feedback because people read it, they send me stories, they send me pictures, and I get that response too. It's been great. It's helped me think about the relationship between word and image. As I say, I'm a literary scholar. I don't often work with images, but I've really found it fascinating to think about that. And then I've used the iPhone pictures I take. I've kind of think of them as placeholders, and I will get my partner, who is a good amateur photographer, to come around and visit these sites again and take good photographs. But I still actually quite like the photographs I take. I've become quite fond of them. So here are just some of the photographs I've taken, and some of these will be very familiar, iconic sites, especially that one in the middle, that laneway. We talk a lot about Melbourne laneways. You know that there's a coffee chain in New York City called Bluestone Cafe, and it's about that association of Melbourne coffee and bluestone. So it's a very, very familiar set of associations. The bottom left is from a laneway in North Carlton that's been taken over by some guerrilla gardeners wanting to make the bluestone laneways a kind of a site of community engagement, building a garden. I love this one here. This is just close to my house, where someone has wanted to protect the bluestone, but also want to make it easy to get the car up over the driveway. And then the top, the kind of the traditional Victorian bluestone foundation for the gateways. Sometimes you see the bluestone without the wrought iron along the edge of the exhibition gardens. You have those bluestone opposite the garden, but they did have the grates in them. So these kind of photographs are kind of part and parcel of the blog. I've also got out a little bit and I've met some of my neighbours. So this is an astonishing house in Nicholson Street. This is a completely unhistorical use of bluestone to make the top part above the veranda. And I was just taking a photograph of it, and the woman inside the house came out and said, "What are you doing?" "Oh, well, I'm taking photographs of bluestone." She invited me in. I met her. Her name is Teresa. She spends most of the day cleaning a house, and here she is in her internal garden. But she built that house, that bluestone, because it would last forever. Fantastic, just another kind of like world opening up for me. Really fun. Then we go into the kind of the art shots. There's this kind of like this lichen in one of the tombstones up in the Melbourne General Cemetery. So I started there to think about the different associations between bluestone and granite. Granite is the conventional stone for masonry, for that kind of monumental stuff. But sometimes in the early period, Victoria has a great history of bluestone. So often the older tombstones and the surroundings are made of bluestone. I also started to think about my workplace differently because of seeing bluestone everywhere. So this is a photograph I took of a pool outside my building, which is up to the top right there. And so I just started to think about how bluestone is used aesthetically as well as culturally and historically. So I'm going to read you, this is how I write, just very, very informally and casually. Not far from my new building, I just moved offices, is a long, shallow pool. Water sits about 2 or 3 centimetres above rows of small bluestone squares. The pool is newish and answers to the longer, deeper rectangular pool that edges the south lawns and leads down to the Medley building. I'm sure you're familiar with it. This pool extends from the new Asia Centre building down towards a peculiar knot of buildings, annexes, odd pathways and tight corners, one of those parts of the campus where it's easy to get lost and where there's no direct path from anywhere to anywhere else. But I just really love this moment of stillness, this sort of the late afternoon sun coming down on the water and this sort of odd little fountain coming down here. So bluestone is often monumental, like St Patrick's Cathedral, the National Gallery, Pentridge Prison. It's often used for churches, especially between about the 1830s and the 1880s. After that, people decided bluestone was often a little bit too forbidding, so it's often broken up by white stucco. But the earlier ones, just because bluestone was such a cheap building material, because it's a local stone, it's this unmitigated bluestone like St Patrick's Cathedral. And bluestone, as we know, lines and frames the city. Was Liza Hallett-Dale from the Melbourne Museum wrote to me, we'd been talking about bluestone, she said, it's like the edging, the framing of the city. I thought that was such a wonderful image. So all those bluestone laneways, all those bluestone foundations just frame the city for us. It has different properties when it's wet, so I really like thinking about the way that the bluestone features here. Just a very, very shallow pool here. These are just tiny little squares of bluestone, so water flows across that all day. Here's another photograph I took, and this is just, again, the iPhone, amazing to me that it can do that. I'm no photographer, but it's still somehow, when you have something to focus the mind, like bluestone, and you see it everywhere, it's been really powerful to see that. And so I actually took a tiny video, which I'll just for a break for my voice, I'm just going to play this little video. This is some, it's going to... So as I say, I'm no video master either, but I just really love that way of just seeing the stillness of that water in that late afternoon. All the students had gone. It was the first week of the semester. Everyone had left, and then there's this moment of stillness that descended, and then the birds came down. And just they're oblivious, of course, to Bluestone as a historical heritage feature, but I really liked thinking about my own workplace and being transformed in that kind of way, and thinking about Bluestone being used figuratively, not structurally, but illustratively. Bluestone is not a material that lends itself very much to carving, although Penelope, I know, has worked on different kind of sculptural form with Bluestone. Mostly it works in that kind of background, understated kind of way. And a lot of people think it is ugly, forbidding, dark. This is the language that is often used about Bluestone. So one of the things I'm doing is actually collecting language that is used to describe Bluestone in that kind of way. But here it's been, I think, transformed by the bird life. And then I also started just taking photographs of thinking about things sitting on Bluestone. This is another kind of point of stillness for me, thinking about what photography can do. Just that classic of just capturing that moment. Here's a feather that just slipped down. These birds are black. Where do these white feathers come from? That was a mysterious moment to me as well. Other photographs I've taken, these are just seed pods from gladitzias that again come out in autumn. So again, sitting on the Bluestone. And I like the juxtaposition here of the geometry of Bluestone, and then the kind of the more natural forms of the seed pods. And again, this is something I haven't got photographs here, but I've really been struck by observing the different ways that Bluestones are laid. So often they're laid very like bricks in a very organised way. Sometimes they're much more higgledy-piggledy. Sometimes when they're not meant to be the outer facing of big public buildings, they're much more random with lots of little and big stones. So you can tell a lot about the kind of the cultural, social positioning of Bluestone by the way that it's actually laid. So I'm becoming a bit of an expert on that as well. Then I also started to think about, again, the more informal uses of Bluestone, and I've really been struck by this site, which is on the corner of Nicholson and Princess Street. Some of you may have walked past it. It's a vacant block at the moment. And this is, you can see the Bluestone foundations of the wall there, and then the smooth brick above. And I've talked to a couple of graffiti experts at Melbourne University, and they say, well, really, Bluestone is not a good surface for doing graffiti on at all because it's so rough, it's so uneven. But nevertheless, here it's been incorporated into, this is a long-running graffiti war on this site. It's absolutely a contested site. So you can see the Aboriginal flag has been painted over. And for an earlier time this year, I was walking to work every day, and so every day I would stop and I would take a picture, and I would see a different point on this sort of contested site. So this is, there's the Aboriginal flag, then there's a graffitiist called Nost, another one called Prism. So there are three painters alternating or taking turns to paint over the site. There's Prism with his tag in the middle. Another day, this is called, apparently, someone calls this the Grub Monster. I know nothing about graffiti, but I did go a little steep learning curve here. There's another one where the Aboriginal flag almost wins, but then the Grub Monster comes over it again. And then it really takes over. I think that's the last photograph. I think that's the last one I've got in the sequence. I haven't been back there for a while, but it's something to... I wouldn't mind doing a little stop motion animation, actually, getting them all working in that way, to see how that works. And then I took this photograph, which is a close-up, and this is actually one of my favourite photographs I've actually taken on the whole project. This is the bottom of the Bluestone. So the top of the yellow is where the Aboriginal, the sun in the Aboriginal flag is sitting there. So here's where Bluestone actually meets the brickwork, and I love that kind of intensive close-up there. I won't read when I'm going up there because I will press on. But these are just some of the local sites I've been thinking about, rethinking my neighbourhood. And someone said to me, you know, you really have to get out of Melbourne and stop just doing Fitzroy. And this is just another little section I wrote, which was absolutely about my life going to and from the university. I didn't take photographs here, so this is an example of the blog writing, which doesn't depend on that photographic image. But I was trying to capture the visual thing without actually having the image of it. Because these are human encounters, I feel a little bit uncomfortable photographing people doing stuff. So this is me. This is my Sarah Jessica Parker Sex and the City kind of moment, just thinking about the encounters of men and women as I observe them on my way to work. But I'm going to finish with another example of me getting out of the city. So I'm starting to move out of Melbourne, and of course what I want to do is go really follow the path of that Bluestone down through the Western District down to Warrnambool, where in fact my family comes from, so it's become very much a local project for me. This is down to Williamstown. I went down to visit the Williamstown Time Ball. So this is the tower in its current state on the left. And it's got a number of dates because it's gone through a number of transformations, and that's just a close-up of the top of the tower. That's a ball at the top. At 1 o'clock every day, that ball drops down, and it's meant to give a kind of a standard model of time for ships going up and forth along Hobson's Bay. But I looked up the history of it, so of course these are not my photographs. So the one on the left is from 1853, pretty much when it was first built. So that's the kind of like the historiographic, the archive, the photographic archive. And then on the one on the right is from 1934, where clearly they had decided the time tower was not big enough, so they put this huge extension on the top of it. They still kept the crenellations, making it kind of like a medieval tower on the top, and then it was painted with a kind of aluminium paint because it functioned both as a lighthouse and as a time tower. So this is just a wonderful example of what photography can do. It just hold that moment when that tower was made twice as high. And then again, as it was then brought down to where it is now, and that time ball itself was recreated and reconstructed in the 1980s. So just a lovely kind of like historical moment there of this iconic tower, but that for a moment had this sort of double height with that aluminium paint on the top of it. And then that final, just to show you, this is the date that 1855, I mean the thing was put up in 1853, but I think the foundation stone was then decorated. But you can see, this is the bluestone, how badly it weathers once you start to carve into it. The fibre is really kind of being damaged there. So this is a lovely kind of just capturing that moment of just progressive decay. So even though bluestone seems so monumental, it's really vulnerable to time. And I think our memories of it can tell a really interesting story. So that's the nature of my project. As I say, really introductory, but I would really welcome comments, suggestions, photographs, stories about bluestone. But I might stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Albertine Hamilton, her paper is Reprogramming Cultural Memory, Conservation in the Digital Age. Albertine is a conservator who also writes. Like many of us in the art sector, she wears several hats, and her practice, both practices inform each other. She recently wrote a wonderful article in magazine where she explored the question of who decides what we conserve and why we conserve the things that we do. She invoked a fabulous quote by David Hockney, which I hope will play some part in what she speaks about this evening. And David Hockney wrote, "Love will decide what is kept, and science will decide how it is kept." Tonight we can expect to hear her talk about the moral dilemmas associated with historical professionals making decisions about cultural memory, and even the way that the conservator's role is changing within the evolution of digital technologies. Albertine is a paper conservator at the State Library Victoria, where she primarily works with archival documents on paper and parchment, maps, plans, photographic materials, and works of art on paper. She graduated from the Master of Cultural Materials Conservation at Melbourne Uni in 2011, and she holds an undergraduate degree in fine art painting from RMIT. Thank you, Albertine.
Thank you. Well, I don't really need to introduce myself now, so I'll just go straight ahead. It seems self-evident that the decision to conserve something, whether tangible or intangible, is in essence a value judgment about whether something is worth remembering, that is, worthy of being brought into the collective cultural memory. Of course, this viewpoint might have something to do with the fact that I work in what is popularly termed a memory institution. Museums, libraries and archives have long been considered a trove for cultural memory, responsible for selecting, documenting, preserving, indexing, interpreting and communicating certain elements of culture. Indeed, memory communication is acknowledged as one of the essential reasons for the existence of these institutions, defined as the construction of representations of the past in accordance with the needs of communities in the present and the future. And how do we communicate memory? By way of its mediator, cultural heritage. If we accept that these institutions are a resource for the communication of memory and that cultural heritage is the vehicle for memory communication, then the heritage professional, the art historian, the architect, the archaeologist, is responsible for identifying which memories or memory vehicles are significant to society and therefore worth preserving. It naturally follows that the conservator is responsible for the act of preserving or otherwise maintaining these items, a job that encompasses many functions and responsibilities. Traditionally, conservation has been associated with the preservation and restoration of the tangible aspects of cultural heritage. The conservator's goal has not only been to prevent further damage or loss, but to retard or at least prevent visible evidence of any change whatsoever to the fabric of the object. Often, the conservator is also required to restore the item to a perceived representative state, which is a judgment regarding an item's true or intended nature. In this way, conservation does not only preserve memories via their memory vehicles, it contributes to their biographies. The question is, if the vehicle for memory is not allowed to age or change or evolve as it otherwise would, does it not become frozen in time as historical memory? How can it contribute to the enhancement of society, present or future, in any relevant way if not allowed to evolve with it? Moreover, how can the viewpoint of one professional possibly take into consideration the feelings and opinions of all cultural heritage stakeholders? Historian Fritz Pannekoek gives a fantastic example of the inevitable discrepancy between community and professional values using the Canadian heritage site, Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump, which, as the name suggests, is where the locals used to hunt bison by stampeding them over the edge of a cliff. In the 1980s, the local heritage professionals enlisted the help of the community to determine what messages should be associated with this site. As one might expect, the stories that came out of this inquiry conflicted with those of the archaeologists and local folklorists who had tracked the oral traditions since their first true accounts in the 1890s. Pannekoek asks us which legends should be used: the true scientifically legitimised legends of the 1890s, or the legends as they have arrived to us today? A more tangible and admittedly extreme example of this divide, which also explores the ethical dilemma of how far should conservation go, is that of Vladimir Lenin's preserved remains. No conservators were not involved in this treatment at any stage. But the issue I'm trying to illustrate will hold true. Since his death and initial embalming in 1924, so much of Lenin's original biological material has been replaced using plastics and other materials that articles are now surfacing with titles like "Lenin's body improves with age." I would argue that this is no longer Lenin's body. However, that is not to say this new entity is not equally significant to Russian society, even if for reasons other than those defined at the outset. At what point in an intervention is an object no longer the same object that you started with? Does this even matter? Is every intervention simply a new layer in the history of an object's biography, contributing to its cultural memory? Perhaps a more appropriate example is the most recent conservation treatment of the Sistine Chapel frescoes, starting in 1980. Obvious, I know, but relevant. In this treatment, conservators worked to remove 500 years' worth of grime and numerous past restoration attempts. The goal? To reveal the true colours of the fresco as heritage professionals believed it had been intended by Michelangelo. What was the response? Locals and critics were less than impressed. They protested that the colours were too intense, that depth had been lost, that the mural no longer looked authentic. In other words, the collective living memory of the community dictated that the fresco should look old. As we later find out, a secco layer of paint had in fact been removed that would have given depth and muted the overall tone. So they were right. But I suppose it could have been worse. I would just like to flag that this notorious restoration attempt was not completed by a conservator. That wasn't us. So these examples serve to illustrate my point, which is Conservators and other heritage professionals, like any human beings, are susceptible to subjectivity, relativity, and cognitive bias in the process of decision-making. And that these decisions impact on an object's biography, which, as we have established, can ultimately influence the development of collective cultural memory. In response to such moral dilemmas, conservators have since adopted simple ethical guidelines from which to make and justify decisions. Full documentation for every treatment, use of archival materials, minimal intervention and reversibility wherever possible. Each decision considers the composition, condition and ageing behaviours of an object as balanced against its provenance, function and aggregate of values according to numerous stakeholders. Indeed, consultation with the stakeholders of cultural heritage has become a large part of what the heritage professional does now. I would just like to say, though, that there is definitely still a place for what we would call interventive conservation treatment, most obviously as it relates to aesthetic objects. Unlike the Memory Institution, which has framed my own conservation principles, the gallery environment enjoys a comparatively rare philosophical clarity. In the case of artworks, the original intent of the maker is often quite clear, even documented. Moreover, the reading of an artwork will typically hinge on its condition. As an example, I've drawn on a recent treatment by NGV conservator Sarah Brown of Identikit Crisis by David McDiarmid, 1978. I won't go into detail because I'm sure I'm going to run over time, but the image is fairly self-explanatory, but I will say that while this treatment, which involved reconstructing the image based on early photographic documentation and a lot of consultation with his archives, while it would be considered highly interventive by most conservation standards, without it this artwork would be visually illegible and therefore removed from artistic discourse and hence unable to contribute to cultural memory in any way. The success of that treatment, however, does not mean that any evidence of an object having changed over time, even if the object in question is valued for its aestheticism, can therefore be removed in clear conscience. In fact, as conservators are realising that an artefact's material and structural integrity interrelates with evidence of historical and cultural memory content, even the treatment of artworks is changing. The dawn of the digital age has presented the conservator with a whole new range of tools with which to approach cultural heritage, removing the need for such moral judgments and value prioritisations. Technologies that directly influence the way that we restore works to their perceived representative state or true nature, but without removing any evidence of history. The first example is fairly low-tech, but very effective. In the Met's current exhibition, Van Gogh, Irises and Roses, a digital slideshow runs alongside the artworks on display, highlighting fairly extensive fading due to the use of a highly fugitive red pigment known as red lake. In fact, it is documented that Vincent van Gogh was even aware of its bad ageing characteristics. This is not to say that he intended for his paintings to fade, but probably just couldn't resist the brilliance of that particular pigment. And fade it did. By showing promotional postcards of the 1890 artwork Roses, produced at different points in its exhibition history, the viewer is given the opportunity to map the ageing process, at least as it occurred between 1928 and today. In this way, the artwork can be appreciated in its current state, while acknowledging that the artwork has gone through a number of different states. Just as the earlier conditions represent the artwork's true nature to people of that time, the current condition represents the true nature of the artwork for our time. Are they working? Ooh. Okay, good. Perhaps more renowned is the restoration of the Harvard Rothko murals, which were unveiled in November of last year. These murals, also notorious for their unstable media, were exposed to almost every damaging element you can imagine. Commissioned for the penthouse at Harvard University's Holyoke Centre, the 5 murals were exhibited between 1964 and 1979 in direct sunlight, in a dining room, splashed with food, bumped by drawn chairs, and vandalised by someone named Alan C. It goes without saying that by the time these artworks were put into storage for their own protection, they were in really grim condition. As such, the murals have only been shown 4 times in the last 35 years. To most conservators, this is the most distressing thing of all, that works which were intended to be looked at and enjoyed had to be physically removed from the cultural consciousness. The restoration strategy for these works developed over several years. To cut a long story short, due to the delicate and highly porous surfaces of the paintings, traditional restoration techniques could not be used. The idea to virtually restore the murals using light projections grew out of a technique developed in the 1980s by conservator Raymond Lafontaine, known as compensating illumination, which essentially used slide projectors with blue and white light to visually counteract the appearance of yellowed varnish on paintings without having to actually remove it. In this case, however, the projection had to restore colour that had been lost in some places and not in others. To do this, the restoration team first had to determine what the paintings had looked like in 1964 and then develop a target image for the projection. The resulting technology used a digital camera to shoot pictures of the murals, which are then compared to restored photographs of the images. The information generated by this comparison is fed to a computer that uses software to create a compensation image, which is sent to a digital projector where it illuminates the murals at a precise intensity for over 2 million pixels per painting. By restoring the original appearance of the paintings without physically altering them, the Harvard restoration team have successfully achieved what the Met tried to do with supplementary digital information. Not only can the murals be enjoyed as they were intended, but for 1 hour each day, the projectors are turned off so that viewers can compare conditions for themselves. Okay. To finish up, I thought I'd just quickly touch on the opportunities that digital technology has presented for cultural heritage that has been entirely lost, particularly in wartime. As I'm sure we're all aware by now, cultural heritage is a powerful tool for enriching culture through identity and memory. And for this reason, it has been a target for manipulation and destruction since the dawn of time, practically. Whether it was Russia's Amber Room, which was seized during World War II by German Nazis, since lost and later reconstructed as pictured here, or the 6th century Bamiyan Buddhas of Afghanistan. Indeed, these iconic statues, which I have pictured, were destroyed in March 2011 by the Taliban as they were considered to be idols. As we know, international opinion strongly condemn this act as an example of extreme religious intolerance. In June of this year, though, 14 years after the fact, and with the permission from UNESCO and the Afghan government, Chinese artists, and I'm going to massacre this, Xinyu Zhang and Hong Lang filled the empty cavities where the Buddhas had once stood with 3D laser light projections. And it looks absolutely incredible. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Dr. Daniel R. Little, his paper is entitled A Psychological Theory of Memory and False Memory, in which he will speak about memory as a dynamic process. Cues in our environment are used to retrieve previously stored information from memory. Can we always trust the information that is retrieved? Daniel Little has a PhD in cognitive psychology and is the head of the Knowledge, Information and Learning Laboratory at the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne. Dr. Little's research focuses on developing mathematical models of perceptual decision-making and recognition memory. Thank you.
Thanks. Hopefully we won't have to fight with these slides too much. So talking to non-psychologists about memory is an interesting task because it's something that we all kind of have a common sense point of view about. And I'm actually just going to do this like this. And because we all have this kind of common sense experience of our own memory, trying to explain what my research is focused on by developing kind of mathematical theories of these common sense understandings is often kind of fraught with communication difficulties. So what I want to try to do today is describe a psychological theory of memory that's really been developed over the past 50 years. And the goal of this theory is to explain and predict performance on memory experiments that we might run in the lab. So these involve giving people lists of things to remember and then testing them on how well they can recall them or recognize the things that we've had them study. So in one sense, our theoretical understanding is based on these very prescribed scenarios. And what I want to try to do is expand on that theory and show how it connects with our broader understanding about the role of photography, both as a cue to memory and also as something we can use to augment our memory. So taking photographs it gives us the ability to distribute our cognition beyond our own minds. So the theory that I'm going to describe really, in essence, what it does is boil down the phenomenon of memory to a number of key factors. And my focus is going to be on sketching out this particular theory. So to do this, I want to give kind of an event or a scene that you can use as an example or an analogy. And you can imagine that you've entered a library and this is something that you might want to remember later. So we know how our sensory system, by which I mean our vision and our audition and our other senses, breaks events down into a large number of very basic features. And these might be things like high and low spatial frequencies, contrast and color and edges, and the way in which objects relate to one another in a scene. And in order to develop a kind of computational theory of memory, so as a mathematical psychologist, our goal is to really develop a theory that we can program into a computer to generate predictions for. What we do is we take each of these basic features and assign them numbers and put them into a big array of numbers. And I've represented that here just by these little grayscale boxes. So each one of these rectangles represents one of these elementary visual features. Now, along with this collection of perceptual features, there are two other types of features that we can classify that are extremely important for memory. And one of those are contextual features, and these are the features which actually put us into our memories. And the idea is these represent and tag our memories in time. So they represent the types of associations that we bring to memories. And this kind of harkens back to Stephanie's talk, the types of associations that each of these bluestone images, which are really just a series of reflections of light that gets filtered via our retina, develop this whole other world of associations to them throughout our experience. In the types of theories of memory that we develop, we have to include that type of information because these things can also be used to cue our memory. So it's not just it's not just our perceptions which matter. It's the associations that we attach to those perceptions which matter. And so we term these things contextual features. And there are other, context can refer to a lot of different things. It can also refer to things like our current state when we're experiencing the event. So everything we learn is experienced in a particular context, which comes to it with a set of preceding and antecedent conditions. And we develop associations between these conditions. So the contextual features might be, if you entered this scene in this library, the things which you immediately experienced prior to it. Or it could be something about your emotional state or your physiological state. So are you hungry? Are you tired? Do you actually want to be in the library? Each of these things can act as a cue to later retrieve that particular memory. Now, in these theories' context, because this idea of associations is so broad and so vast, it's very hard to get an idea about what these associations actually are. All we know is that in our theories, if we don't include them, then our models tend to fail. We're not able to predict the things we want to predict if we don't take into account the fact that people develop associations between a wide variety of different things. Whenever information enters into our perceptual system, or into our brain is really what I'm trying to say, at that point in time there is no meaning attached to anything. It's just a series of neurons firing, representing kind of our sensory awareness of information. The meaning that we attach to the information which is coming into the system is really what the role of memory is for. So we don't have the capacity to remember everything that we're presented with, and really we focus on information which is related to our goals. So to kind of highlight that, if you entered into the scene with the goal of finding a particular book, then your attention really draws your focus to the things which are either attention grabbing without being important, or are directly related to the sorts of things that we want to achieve. So our goals drive our attention in a way which filters out a lot of the aspects of our environment from actually ever getting into our memory in the first place. So I've just sort of highlighted this here by the second row, where you can see that some of the information which is in the scene actually drops out. It gets filtered out by our perception. This stage of the process is something that we term encoding, and the idea is that the information as it comes from our environment is encoded via attention into a form which we can use then to retrieve information from memory. So what we end up encoding may end up looking a lot different from the situation that we're actually experiencing. Because it's filtered through our attention, we lose many of the details, and we pick up only on those details that we pay attention to. So this type of filtered information is then used to contact the things that we've already stored in memory, both via its sensory form, so its perceptual form, and via the context that we've associated with it. And these things are used to drive our retrieval processes. And from our memory then, we pull out the what we call the semantic features, or the meaning that's associated with those particular perceptual and contextual features. So, in essence, the features that enter into the kind of memory system are data that our mind is trying to explain, and we retrieve things from memory to form a narrative to actually string together those details that we actually make it into memory. So, and then these filled-in representations are then stored both as context-specific short-term memories. So these are things like what's termed episodic memory, which is associated with our own personal experiences, but also as long-term knowledge, which is relatively context-free. So you might be able to recall the last time that you were in a library, but your actual knowledge of what a library is and its function, and your conceptual knowledge about what a library is for, is divorced from any particular episode of you learning about that experience or having that experience. In effect, the way we think this operates is that over time, the context that is associated with these things tends to average out to form some sort of long-term knowledge or concept about what a particular event means. So the important aspects of the theory are that attention filters our perception, and our perceptions are tied to these particular contexts that we experience them in. And then the details are what we use as cues to retrieve the kind of meaning. So memory provides us with a set of expectations which we use to fill in the details which are filtered out by attention. What I want to do in the rest of the talk is really then look at photography as an example of this, and how this kind of illustrates these kind of key points. And the first experiment I want to talk about is an experiment run by Daniel Schachter's lab, which has a connection to this particular exhibition. So in the exhibition booklet, there's an essay by Scott Guerin, who worked in Daniel Schachter's lab. And in this experiment, what they studied was the role of photographs as cues and the benefits you get out of using photographs as cues to memory. So in this, they tested, they had both younger and older adults study a video, watch a video, and then they had to recall events from that video either without viewing photographs first or viewing photographic stills from the video. And the key thing to note here is that there is a decline in memory with age. So older individuals do experience natural memory decline. But having photographs as cues to retrieval actually helps. So they're able to improve their recall performance. And photo review actually helps both the young group and the old group equally. One of the studies which Scott Guerin talked about in his essay was a study on false memory. So there's a negative aspect to photographs, which is that they are an extremely powerful cue. We tend to believe that what we're seeing in a photograph is actually true. And this has implications for the types of things that we either retrieve from memory or the types of beliefs that we string together to explain why we're seeing this particular photograph. So in this study, this is a really amusing study. They contacted family members of the participants in the study and had them give them photographs from their childhood. And they took the photograph that they were given. They took a series of photographs, but at least for one or two of the photographs, they photoshopped it into a hot air balloon in this particular example, and then showed the photograph to the participants, and then interviewed them a number of times. And what this figure here is showing is just that over successive interviews, the number of times that they recall information which is absolutely false begins to increase. But more interesting is when you actually read their transcripts of the interviews. So in the first interview, they see this photo of them, which never happened, and they say, no, I never actually thought I'd been in a hot air balloon, so there you go. So they know that this had never happened. And the interviewer prompts them, you can't remember anything about this event. Nah, it is me though, no memory whatsoever. And then the interviewer being the interviewer, if you want to take the next few minutes and concentrate on getting a memory back, something about the event. The subject at this point is, no, yeah, honestly, no, I can't. That's really annoying. So they're irritated that they have this photo in front of them, but they can't actually retrieve any information about it. By the third interview, though, the situation starts to change. So the interviewer says, same again, tell me everything you can recall about event 3 without leaving anything out. Just trying to work out how old my sister was, trying to get the exact when it happened. I'm still pretty certain it occurred when I was in 6th grade at the local school there. So they've now formed this belief that this was an actual true event. Basically, for $10 or something, you could go up in a hot air balloon and go up about 20-odd meters. It would have been a Saturday, and I think we went, with my parents. No, not my grandmother. Not certain who any of the other people are there. I'm pretty certain that Mom is on the ground taking the photo. So they've invented this whole story to explain the fact that they're given this very strong image, this particular cue, which must be true. It's a photograph. And they've filled in this false memory. So the general idea is that unless you have a good reason to believe otherwise, you'll tend to believe that these photographs are true and use them to construct a narrative which explains them. So just in terms of kind of the psychological theory, these false cues also lead us to falsely fill in information to explain them. So there's another study by Elizabeth Loftus, who does a lot of work on false memory, where she showed people doctored photos of historical political events. So this is the Tiananmen Square, either with or without large protest crowds included. And then had people estimate how many people they thought were in the crowd. And when you see a photo which has a lot of people in it, that tends to change what people later believe about that actual event. So people seeing the doctored photo estimated that there were more than 1 million people. That was the highest estimated percentage. Now these properties can also be exploited for propaganda purposes. So the top photo shows a photograph of Barack Obama and Hosni Mubarak from 2010. The real photo on the left, you can see that Hosni Mubarak is the person on the far left, sort of trailing behind all of the other members. The photo that they printed in the Egyptian paper took him from that position and put him slightly in front of Barack Obama to kind of, I guess, elevate his status. Unfortunately for him, somebody found this photograph and pointed this out. There's a whole collection of these things on 4and6.com of the history of kind of doctored images. It's interesting that these images go right back to the beginnings of photography as well. So there's an iconic image of Abraham Lincoln shown on the left, which is actually his head superimposed on someone else's body. And this was taken in 1860, only a few decades after the first permanent photograph was produced. So you can see that these looking at photographs, they have this huge benefit because we can take information and store it outside of our own minds. But they also have this negative consequence, which is that the information isn't true. It's a powerful cue for us to fill in missing information in a way which is false. The last thing I wanted to talk about was the flip side of that, which is the effect of taking photos on memory. So I'm sure all of these scenes will look familiar to anyone who's ever been to a public gathering. The use of smartphone cameras has increased exponentially in the past decade. And Linda Henkel has done some research on examining what the consequence is of delegating our experience to a smartphone rather than trying to remember it for ourselves. So in this study, what she did was she took 46 people to a museum, and they were each given a smartphone camera and led around to 36 different exhibits. Some of the exhibits they were told the name of and told to photograph as wholes, whereas others they were told to zoom in and take a photo, and others they were just told to experience on their own. And a day later they were brought back and they were given either the names again or photos someone else had taken as cues and asked whether or not they recognized these images or not. And there's a detriment to actually taking a photo of an object. People remember it, seeing it less often than if they had just observed it without taking the photo. There is a benefit, however. There's a slight increase in how accurately people can recognize things if they zoom in on it. And the kind of reasoning here is that zooming in on something is kind of acting like the process of attention that we naturally employ anyway. And that lends itself to being closer to what our mind's eye is doing whenever we focus in. So this idea of a spotlight of attention is being captured by this idea of zooming in on the photos. So we're picking up on details that we might have picked up on anyway. We don't tend to stand back and sort of take in whole views of things. So photos, they help us retrieve memories, but these may be true or false memories because they're such powerful cues. And taking photos alters our attention because we store the action in the context that we're actually experiencing it and not the event itself in the context of what we're experiencing. Thanks very much.